Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my webinar series, Ditching Diet Culture. For those of you returning for week 4, thank you so much for joining me again. And for those of you who are joining now for the first time, welcome. I'm really excited. This is the concluding episode of this webinar series. I've had a really great time with it. I hope that you have too. If you had a chance to watch one episode, all of them, see the recordings, whatever that may be, I'm very appreciative for you being here with me today. So a couple of quick housekeeping things before I get started on the presentation. This broadcast will be recorded, so if you need to dip out early or if you know someone who might benefit from the information that I'm sharing tonight, I will have the recording after the webinar is over. I'll also be posting it on YouTube. That's what I've been doing. So I'll send the link out to that probably sometime tomorrow. And then the other thing too is that I created a survey, a post-presentation survey that I would love to send out to you all if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to just participate in kind of just an evaluative survey. I would love to do this stuff again in the future, and I want to know how I can do better, what I'm doing well, what's working, and what other content you guys would like to see covered by a dietitian. And then last, like the other episodes, this will be an hour long. The presentation is set for about 30 minutes or so. And then the rest of the hour is designated for discussions and questions, however long we have for that. And then if you do have a question as the presentation goes on, just save them for the end. We'll have plenty of time for that. And so last thing, I just want to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Riley Peterson. I am a registered dietitian and I own my own practice, Balanced Life Nutrition Consulting. This series started because this topic is really the foundation of my kind of nutrition philosophy. I feel very strongly that reframing from diet culture is really important and essential for success and achieving our health and wellness goals. So with that being said, let's get into the last topic. I titled this episode a long time ago, and I think I don't necessarily agree with the title now. Today's episode is called Balanced Nutrition. The idea is balancing kind of the view of our bodies and the biases we have against weight status in this country with health and how that kind of plays out. So I will now go over the objectives for today's episode. For those of you who haven't seen episodes 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to review those so that way we can kind of be up to date on what content I'm covering. I'm going to explain the problem we have with self-image in our culture because it's a big part of diet culture. I'm going to present a challenging conundrum of nutrition, health status, body positivity. They are complicated altogether, but my effort is to try and balance all three. And then I'm also going to kind of suggest some of the current body positivity movements we have out there, such as HAES or health at every size, and some of the controversies, but really the underlying messages that are really important. Okay, so review of episodes 1, 2, and 3. For those of you who have seen them, bear with me for a moment. I'm just going to go through them briefly. So if you're joining again for the first time, I'll kind of catch you up first on episode 1. We discussed the damaging nature of diets. So dieting is this multi-billion-dollar industry that really caters directly to the challenges that come up when people are trying to make lifestyle change. You'll hear these red flag diet phrases, as I call them, thinking, words like quick and easy or melting the fat away, melting the weight away. Ultimately, because quick results are what people are looking for, and so this industry caters to those quick results with these language. But we talked about how and why this quick and easy method is really damaging, more damaging than helpful, in fact. Falling into a yo-yo dieting cycle can create a higher threshold of fat loss every time you go around that cycle. And it can create irregulation in our metabolic and hormonal regulation, things like hunger and satiety hormones that get messed up when you diet. And then dieting can also inherently increase this negative and unhealthy mindset. namely the idea of restriction, guilt, and rigidity in our food choice and structure. Ultimately, these side effects of diet culture are detrimental to the longevity and sustainability of our health habits. From there, in episode 2, we discussed an alternative, which is food freedom. I define food freedom as a means of achieving our health and wellness goals and maintaining a healthy relationship with food without that guilt, restriction, rigidity that I just mentioned. An important framework to guide this principle is called intuitive eating. And from there, we can kind of further stratify into the tools in which we use to intuitively eat, called mindful eating. Mindful eating techniques are all centered around the idea of slowing down and eating more intentionally, really taking the time to pay attention, listen to hunger and fullness, and identifying some of those emotional or situational triggers that come up when we eat or make food choice, and being empathetic towards them. So rather than feeling the guilt and shame, we try to reframe that. And that brings us to last week's episode, in which we discussed some strategies to practice this new mindset of food freedom and the mindful eating techniques. Just like any other physical skill, it's essential to practice this shifting away, this mindset shift from the culture of diet. Strategy number 1 that we talked about was to make a list of rules that you've made for yourself centered around eating and food choice. Think hard about them and determine if you need to make a plan to say goodbye to those rules. Strategy 2 was to ditch the scale and the fixation on the numbers that you see, those numbers that indicate weight change. There are so many non-scale victories, that I like to call them, that we can pay attention to. So try and practice that shift. Strategy number 3 was to find both the good and bad qualities of food choice. So reframing your mindset around food. And when you find yourself trying to talk yourself out of a food that you see as unhealthy or undesirable, try to challenge that and see how you can flip it. How can you make it good? Strategy number 4 was to ditch diet language. So really paying attention to the word and the verbiage that we use around dieting and weight and whatnot as they come up. So when someone comments on how healthy or unhealthy your food is, remind them of the good and the bad that I just shared in strategy 3. You know, when someone compliments a friend for losing weight, try and reinforce something positive about them that really reinforces something non-appearance related. Strategy number 5 was to remember the average. Remembering that a healthy life can be maintained by not letting yourself fall to either end of the restriction or indulgence spectrum. Allowing yourself both in moderation can improve that health average long term. And last, with strategy 6, was affirmation. Always affirming the strides that you're making to make lifestyle change, because it's challenging and your actions add up no matter how small. Remind yourself how proud of yourself you should be all the time. Do it, just do it. And of course, there are major barriers that this practicing mindset can kind of bring up. Our relationships with food and food choice is very complex, and especially in light of the diet culture that is ingrained in our society. Using mindfulness and some of these strategies are really the first step in kind of unlearning this norm. And so with today's episode, I thought it would be a good idea to discuss the movements that have brought this shift away from diet culture and how balancing health and indulgence can be a really important thing. It's not easy to wrap your head around this, so let's kind of first start by getting into the challenges that this culture kind of just brings up in the first place and validating that. So how do we as a society, you know, American society, how do we view indulgence in health? I think part of diet culture is ingrained in the brands that we buy from and who we see represented on our screens or in magazines, on websites and TV, etc. So often we see one body type on screen, you know, a thin, toned, white body. And those who we see on screen are 100% not representative of who we might see on the street. In size, in shape, in ethnicity, there is so much more variation than what we see in front of us in media. Even more so, and this is, I'm kind of talking a lot about women, but this applies in men too. Those who we see on screen are also photoshopped and airbrushed and fabricated. You know, we see women especially being portrayed as strong, but not too strong, you know, toned and unblemished. It's all unachievable because it's not always real. And that's who he has as visual role models to compare ourselves against for decades. This is what the norm has been for decades. Thinness is desirable. You know, belly rolls and cellulite are to be hidden. Lose the weight, suck it in, cover your blemishes, as if they're not part of just a natural human body. So you know, I think that's it's really the part of this is just how we see ourselves in society. So take a look at this image. I know you've seen this image before, and you've probably seen a lot of images just like it. You know, this is just one picture, but you know, up until recently, I think the Victoria's Secret show ended recently, but up until recently, this has happened every year. You see a collection of models on stage. They all look very similar. They all are one body type. These women are thin and they're beautiful, of course, but how many people do you actually know who look just like this? Is this representative of the people that you see day to day? And even when we do see, you know, larger bodies on screen, they are often categorized as a plus size model. Why can't they just be regular models, but they have to be labeled as such? And so it distinguishes them as different. Why can't they be models just like their counterparts? You know, I'm sure that you've read these articles describing the way in which these women got to this point, the diets that they had leading up to the show, the diet, and same thing too with you hear, you know, stories of actors and actresses who go through really significant diet and lifestyle changes to achieve a certain look on screen. You know, they are going for this one occasion, this one event, and oftentimes these diets that lead them there are really unsustainable. A lot of the diet culture that I talked about previously, they're extreme to get them to an extreme look. So why do we idolize them so much for doing something that's so unrealistic? You know, for a long time, this perfect image was not necessarily associated with a higher status of health, but more of an aesthetic look. You know, who cares how you got there as long as you got there, right? But thankfully, I think we've moved a little bit away from this as a society, moving towards an emphasis on a healthy and active lifestyle. You know, that's become more of the focus. Alongside these beautiful, perfect, again, white bodies, there are now words of encouragement of activity, healthy recipes, you know, healthy substitutions for unhealthy foods. You get articles, you read things on the internet, you read things in magazines, whatnot. But the emphasis ultimately is still on one body type. Bias against larger bodies still exist. You know, there are great lengths in which we go to achieve the perfect body. And then I'm sure you've seen something like this, popularized by the Kardashians, where, you know, they put these things on TV and people suddenly think that if they try that, they might look just like them. You know, they popularize these skinny teas and things that necessarily aren't the most healthy and these unrealistic body expectations. And then there's Photoshop. And we erase the rolls, we erase the cellulite, the blemishes on our skin. We erase these things as if they're ugly or undesirable. They're to be hidden. And that's extremely damaging. You know, when you see this, you think, I shouldn't, why are they erasing it? What other reason could they be erasing it for if not if it was undesirable? And it's extremely, extremely damaging. You know, we get this message of encouraging health and wellness, but yet we're still seeing nutrition and activity goals focused on weight loss over health, you know, melting the fat away rather than seeing it as like normal and functional. Again, there is function for fat on our bodies. It's there for a reason. You know, wishing like we looked like someone else over loving our own bodies and the amazing things that our bodies can do for us, carrying us around every day, and protecting ourselves against disease and illness. You know, we see our bodies in a certain way and we wish we looked like this other person, but it's so hard not to when in media we're idolizing a very specific body type. And you might think, these are strong, healthy bodies. I want to look like them because I want to be strong and healthy too. And, I'm sure a lot of these people have worked really hard and really, have been very healthy to achieve a certain look. But ultimately, we just don't know. We don't know what they did to get there. We don't know their lab data. We don't know if they have any underlying health conditions. We assume that they are healthy because they are skinny. But why can't these bodies also be assumed to be healthy? Is it because they're in larger bodies? I think we have a bias to assume that larger bodies are associated with unhealthy habits or, unhealthy diseases or illnesses, etc. So often we equate weight status to health status. And I think we need to challenge that. These are healthy bodies. Just like this is a healthy body, just like these might be healthy bodies. Ultimately, we don't know, and we have to start challenging the biases that we have for or against certain body types, assuming one way or another. We equate weight status to health status, meaning that the heavier we are, the more unhealthy we are, or vice versa. So weight status does not equal health status. It can, but that should not be the assumption. We must challenge our own biases here, because whether you notice them or not, they exist as a result of the culture that we belong to. It is commonly acknowledged that being overweight or obese is bad for your health. It's common to assume that excessive weight or excessive fat puts us at risk for things like heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer, etc. These things can be true, but it's not always true. And we need to stop projecting that on individuals because of weight status. And vice versa. We need to stop projecting that just because thin bodies look healthy because of the culture and how that's ingrained into our society does not necessarily mean that they may be healthy. So let me say it again. I'm going to say it a million times. Weight status does not equate to health status. There are so many biases that exist within our society, as I said, but it also affects the research, the scientific research, the health research that we conduct, and our healthcare system. It's unfair of our society to project these biases on ourselves and others. It introduces bias into our research, and it, like I said, it can impact our healthcare system and how larger bodies or smaller bodies exist within it. So let me give you an example. I have worked in the healthcare setting. In past hospital institutions I've worked in, I would screen patients in the morning, and we would categorize patients with nutrition risk based on certain criteria. One of these criteria was BMI. And so I'm going to go into BMI next. And I'm going to define it really quick before I finish the story. So if you're not familiar with it, you have some context. BMI is the ratio of your weight in kilograms by your height in meters squared. And so it takes a snapshot of your kind of size and weight. It is one measurement. When I was in this hospital setting, a overweight or an obese BMI was classified as nutrition risk. And I worked at a children's hospital. And we were required to address with a child and their family while they're in an inpatient setting, not dealing with a horrible flu or a broken arm or cancer treatment. We were asked to address their weight status based on BMI alone with this family in this setting. It was inappropriate. It felt inappropriate. And I understood why it was in place, because this measurement was ingrained in society for a very long time. But we had to assume that because their BMI was classified as obese, they were unhealthy. Or even that they were obese in the first place, because I'm going to get into this next. BMI is not reflective of weight status in general. Point being, we were required to assume poor health status because that needed to be addressed on BMI alone. So like I said, BMI is used to classify weight status. So these are the classifications: underweight, normal, overweight, obese. But what BMI doesn't take into consideration is bone structure or muscle structure or, just general proportions in general. If you're really short, BMI does not favor you. If you're really tall, BMI does not favor you either. You may be classified as underweight or overweight, even if that's not really the best picture of who you are or what your status is. Also, the history of BMI is pretty racist and very frustrating. It was invented by a white mathematician more than 100 years ago. He was not a doctor. He was not a health expert. He was not a scientist. He was a mathematician who wanted to get measurements that he could use to assess what he called the ideal man, or the average man, excuse me. The average man was white, able-bodied, and not a woman or child. So now we use BMI to classify our society based on this average, which is not even close to representative of our population as a whole. Oh, and also he used this as a kind of like something to stand on when his colleagues and him were discussing the theory of eugenics. It's very racist, it's very outdated, and it's not a good representation of our health status. Yet, we are using it to reflect the health status of our population. And that usually leads to implication that overweight or obese individuals classified by BMI are less healthy, as evidenced by my experience working in hospitals and speaking with colleagues about how that's common throughout other healthcare systems. Again, this can be true. Health status can be impacted by weight, but it's just not right to make that assumption based on very limited data and very, inaccurate data. You can exist in a smaller body and be healthy. You can also exist in a smaller body and be malnourished. You can exist in a larger body and be healthy. You can exist in a larger body and be at risk for health conditions like heart disease and diabetes, etc. And people seem surprised by this sometimes. You can exist in a larger body and be malnourished. There's a whole spectrum, and size does not reflect our health status as a whole. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this, this movement. It's called Health at Every Size, or HAES, like I mentioned earlier in this episode. And these are some of the kind of messages that I think HAES really emphasizes and advocates for. So first is respect. We celebrate body diversity. We honor our differences in size, age, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, religion, class, other human attributes. That's a big one. We have critical awareness where we challenge these institutions and these assumptions, like BMI, for example. We value body knowledge and experience. We also have the compassionate self-care, in which we're finding joy in moving one's body and being physically active, really encouraging that healthy lifestyle. And eating flexibly, like I've tried to encourage this whole series. There are a lot of criticisms about Health at Every Size. I think some of them are valid. I think some of them are very invalid. Ultimately, when I brought this topic up in the very beginning of this episode, it's a conundrum. It's trying to balance the health, the body acceptance, and the body love, and trying to challenge the biases that we have in our culture. So one of the common critiques is that just because health at every size can exist doesn't mean it does exist. Just because health at every size doesn't mean it has to be health at every size. The reason that we associate health status with weight status is because so many unhealthy behaviors that contribute to diminished health and to disease state can also lead to weight gain. And that's where I think this bias comes from. However, in making this assumption, you're putting a burden on the only observable judgment that you can make on an individual without knowing their health and picture as a whole. and that's weight status, what you can observe. And so while I understand the critiques of health at every size, I still want to encourage, healthy eating, moderation in all things, active lifestyles where we can, really try and encourage those wellness traits and habits as a whole to keep our heart healthy, our liver healthy, our kidneys, our skin, our mobility. I don't think that, I think the emphasis in this movement is really not assigning those attributes to weight status, because it's just not reflective of the real picture here. Again, I'm always going to encourage these healthy lifestyle factors. And I'm going to go back really quick 1 second. The other thing too I want to just say is that if weight loss could increase your quality of life or your health status, that is entirely valid. My point in discussing this topic is that our culture places a high significant burden on weight status without addressing or understanding our culture or biases behind it. This is why this is so challenging. We must simultaneously unlearn the diet culture, celebrate our body diversity, and strive for a healthy and active lifestyle. So it's not easy to piece all these things together. But ultimately, that's why I'm talking about this today, is because I think it's important to introduce. And oftentimes we don't discuss this enough. Can we balance the acceptance of larger bodies, loving ourselves, the roles and the cellulite, and the periods in which you're more immobile and you're not eating as healthy? Can we balance all of that while we're still striving for health and emphasizing healthy behaviors? Yes, I think we can. Can we encourage weight loss for improved health outcomes and maybe just an overall state of being? I mean, personally, I've lost weight at one point where, maybe I didn't need to be healthy, but it made me feel better. That was also valid. Yes, we can do that. These things can all exist together. They do not have to be mutually exclusive. My point in discussing this topic today is just acknowledging the strain that our society has put on us, the things that we kind of subconsciously ingest day in and day out when we see it on our screens, on our computers, on our phones and TV. And just acknowledging that and giving yourself a little bit more forgiveness and loving yourself a little bit more for your body, for what it can do for you, and using those healthy lifestyle factors to kind of carry you through the long run. Because ultimately, that's what's more important. It's not weight status. It's the choices that we make day in and day out about food and our health that really can carry us through. And with that being said, that concludes my 4-part series. Again, this is all being recorded, and I will share this with everyone after the presentation. I really appreciate you all coming and really digging in deeper with me. I know this is like a challenging topic to talk about, but again, it's really important to me. And I hope to kind of introduce this thought process to anybody and everybody I can. So if anybody has any thoughts or comments or questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If you want to challenge me on something, if you want to tell me I'm wrong, please do. I'm very much open to that. But yeah, I'll kind of leave it up and I'll unmute everybody. And if you have anything you want to say, please feel free. If not, thanks again for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. I think we can.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Well, this was great. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's a lot of food for thought. I like this ending, about you can be larger and still be, still be healthy. I mean, I'm trying so hard for the healthy part of it and have that be number one and have, the jeans fitting once again be a benefit. versus the genes.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important, like I'm bringing back to like the feeling good part is that, weight loss can happen for a million different reasons, but ultimately those feel good moments are the motivating pieces that I try to encourage because they just don't really come up enough in discussion.
Right. Well, being 62, there's a lot that I've learned over the years. And, now we know so many of the health benefits.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's kind of a scary world out there being overweight as to what's going on the inside. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not the end all be all, but it can help with a lot of things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too that like, we put so much, emphasis on, um, weight loss for so many reasons, but ultimately it's not necessarily, um, I think like the scientific part of it, it's not always the weight loss that's the helpful piece. It's the lifestyle factors and those types of changes that go behind it that are really supporting health.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
But thank you. I appreciate your feedback and your perspective.
No, no, but I've told you this, you've been wonderful. So articulate and knowledgeable and obviously passionate. So it's all good.
Thank you very much.
Riley, one of the questions that I had, you talked about BMI, which is so, linked to weight, and a lot of people get fixated on the number on the scale. And especially if you have people who are gaining muscle or whatever, that may not be the best measurement for success. So a
Right.
lot of people look to their clothes. And I find myself in that XL, kind of 2XL, kind of tinkering back and forth, but it's tough when you're surrounded by a world where, they may not always have that 2XL size, or, it's one of those things like, let me see if we have it in the back or check online. And I think that for me, I think that drives a lot of the desire to lose the weight and fat, but it is toxic, kind of for the mentality purposes. What are your thoughts about that? And not kind of fixating on the weight, but looking at your clothes and kind of size, but then you have these outside factors in the world contributing to that.
I think that's a phenomenal point, and is another factor in the biases that are ingrained into our society. I think that there are a lot of companies out there who don't accommodate like a normal spectrum of sizes that can fit the population. Um, and I think it's because like there is this understanding that there is a normal size, and I think that is just so disjointed with the reality of the world. And again, it's just not necessarily reflective of our society. And so I think it's just one of those biases that exist in the world where finding, the right size is a challenge. And I am appreciative that I see more companies out there who are expanding, the spectrum of sizes out there. But again, um, I I hope in making this discussion more popularized that more companies continue to do that, because again, it's a bias that exists in our society, and it's frustrating, and I can't even imagine. So I want to, I hope to bring awareness to that and empathize with that, because that I can imagine would be extremely frustrating.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm tall, I'm big boned, I'm not petite, like you happen to be. So a lot of times And especially if I don't want it hugging me, and XL doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think that's another great point to bring up, Lynn, is that I just, as we talk about, you know, acknowledging, you know, with Black Lives Matter, acknowledging white privilege, there is such thing as thin privilege. You know, my parents are small people, and I inherited that frame. And so I think that I have to acknowledge that in my world, I don't have to look elsewhere, and I don't have to make certain strides to find clothes that
Mm-hmm.
comfortably. So yeah, I acknowledge that privilege in my own life. It's just it's very something that needs to be said and talked about more, because it doesn't seem um, as obvious to people, but it's certainly a factor. You know, I did talk a little bit about how you can be, you know, thin and unhealthy, but I don't think that is nearly as, it's not the same. It's not the same as the bias that we have in our society towards disability and you know, all sorts of other things that we find are hard to accommodate, like our people find hard to accommodate with.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you one question about a food? I happened to just have the discussion, you know, with somebody when I told somebody I had bought the, you know, Fage yogurt, plain 2%.
Okay.
But then I decided, someone had told me that the 0% fat was, it was delicious. It was still very rich, you know, thick,
Yeah.
you know, as theirs are. And I am just curious, is there something about the non-fat that's not healthy? I mean, it used to be, you know, I know no sugar or no fat, no this, no that. I know that's not mostly true, but I am just curious with something like that, if it makes a difference.
Right. Um, you know, it's hard to say just in looking at one product. You know, I think what's more relevant is that one product in perspective of your entire day of eating.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, you know, let's say that you are watching saturated fat for whatever reason. Using a 0% or non-fat yogurt is a great way to cut out some saturated fat. Yogurt is an animal product. Saturated fat exists in animal products. And so if you enjoy the non-fat versus the 2% just as much, and that substitution isn't, you know, anything like taking away from your enjoyment of eating it, I
Right.
think it's a great option. Personally, I know my diet is really high in fat in other, I like avocado, and I use olive oil a lot to cook, and peanut butter and things like that. And I really actually enjoy one certain product. It's like a Greek yogurt. I think it's, I mean, I don't know if you guys have Sprouts over there, but I
We
really,
have Sprouts.
yeah, like Sprouts non-fat Greek yogurt. I think it's a great product. Now, if they don't have the 0% and I have to choose the 2%, fine. But yeah, so I just kind of use it as a way of like kind of like controlling when I know that in perspective of my entire day, I eat a lot of fat. But I don't necessarily think there's a benefit or a disadvantage to choosing non-fat over whole fat or like 2%. I hear the discussion a lot more with milk. I know I've talked with clients and patients before who I maybe recommend to switch to a lower fat product, and they don't like it because they can taste how it's not as creamy, it's not as, you know, filling, whatnot. So in that case, that would, I'd say, is the biggest disadvantage. If the quality or the taste affects you more.
Mhm.
Yogurt, I don't taste it as much than compared to milk, but ultimately, I think that it's just as good. So if you do like it, I think it's a great kind of lower fat alternative. Ultimately, saturated fat is definitely one of those things that I try to limit or encourage people limit in our diet. So I think it's a great product, and Greek yogurt has its good protein quality too.
Right. Thank you.
Welcome. Anything else?
No, this has been so great.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you for coming. Well, thank you guys both for coming. I appreciate your time. If any other questions come up, please let me know. You know how to reach me. And then I will go ahead and probably send up a follow-up email tomorrow morning with the recording and the survey and whatnot.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your night.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.